and welcome back to the Ideal Nutrition podcast. My name is Torwen and I'm here today with my co-host Aidan. Hope you're all having a wonderful day wherever you're listening from. Today we are going to give you our rapid fire thoughts on these 5 current diet trends. We're going to be exploring things like the carnivore diet, raw dairy, intermittent fasting, the electrolyte drink hype, and also GLP-1 medication diets. I'm pretty excited for this one. Are you?
Yeah, I'm keen. This is a new format for us, but as we were prepping for this, I was thinking we could do heaps of those. So actually on that topic, if anyone listening has feedback, if you like this, let us know. If you don't like it, let us know. And we may or may not do more based on that.
And if there's any topics that you'd like us to cover, we can absolutely take feedback for that as well. Now, I want to start with a trend that I think should have ended as soon as it started, and somehow it's still going. So let's talk about the carnivore diet.
So we'll do a bit of pros and cons. I'm going to start with some pros. So the main, easy, obvious one is weight loss. And this is because if you are only eating carnivore and you're excluding everything else, it's very likely you end up in a calorie deficit. And this is a common one that the majority of people who go carnivore see. They see weight loss. You could argue that that is a pro. Another debatable pro is that it will, in many cases, lead to avoiding triggers / intolerances because it is avoiding a lot of these common triggers and intolerances. And that could lead to improvement in symptoms and conditions.
I wanted to back onto the back of this one because, yes, you often see online that people report they have reduced bloating. They all of a sudden feel so much better, so much more energy, all these sorts of things. And the reason the carnivore diet seems to work initially in reducing these symptoms is because it does cut out a lot of the foods like FODMAPs, any sort of food chemicals, those sorts of things that can cause gas and bloating in a lot of people. So when you do cut them out, of course, you are going to feel a lot better initially. If we focus on long-term then, and I'm not sure if we're ready to go into the rest of the cons yet, you are doing a big disservice to your overall gut health. We know that any sort of plant-based variety is super positive in supporting a good gut microbiome, making sure that you do get enough fibre and micronutrients as well.
I also think it can create a bit of a self-fulfilling loop where it's hard to reintroduce stuff. Like I see that people go carnivore, symptoms improve, and then they try adding plants back in and they get symptoms straight away. And it's a bit of a, see, I was right. I can't eat. And there often is like it is often talked through that lens of being like, I can't eat anything else because of this. But there are many cases where this is it's created by the lack of diversity, which then changes the microbiome and changes bacteria that will break down some of these things. And you could also make an argument that very slow exposure to reintroducing these things could be a step back towards this as well.
Yeah. Now, there are other cons there, and I think we explore a few of them as well because there is not a lot of research on long-term carnivore diet, and that's an issue for a few reasons. We know that carnivore diet, when you are basing your diet mainly off things like meat, you naturally have a higher saturated fat intake. So things like high cholesterol levels, LDL levels, even just your kidney function due to having such a high intake of protein, we don't know for sure what the implications of that are longer term.
Yeah, contributing, like going on from that with fiber intake, we have very clear long-term data showing that high fiber intake is typically a good thing for a reduced risk of chronic disease. The thing that I've often found interesting about carnivore is the confidence that some of the people at the top have that some of these proposed problems are not an issue. That, for example, even high cholesterol, like a common line is that high cholesterol in the absence of high blood glucose levels is not an issue, is a very common thing said. Fiber is not essential, so it's not an issue if we're not having it. But we have all of this data, and I won't name names, but there was one particular person leading the front on carnivore who his LDL cholesterol was about 15 millimole per litre. And I point that out being like, there is a lot of confidence that this is not an issue. For anybody listening, that's just extremely high. Like it's like I've been a dietitian for 10 years. That's higher than I have ever seen in a patient ever. And it would take extreme confidence in that belief. But then you go back to the point that you've said about there's not much long-term data. And then 2, there's not even that much anecdotal data. Like we don't have a lot of people existing out there with an LDL cholesterol of 15 to even confirm that that is or isn't fine. So I don't know, food for thought there.
Absolutely. And I did have a little look at some studies, what they did say as well. And if we're looking at the nutrient composition in general, not just focusing on things like fiber and obviously extreme fats and things like that, but we're also falling short in a lot of necessary nutrients, things like calcium, vitamin C, thiamine, iron, folate, iodine, potassium, so many things that you're not getting through diet that are well below the recommended levels that we should be having daily. So
yeah, there are certain ways around this, and what I find is if somebody does a quote unquote well executed carnivore diet where they do nose to tail type of eating, they're eating these nutrient rich foods like liver, for example, they can get around a lot of that stuff. Sometimes people would have a slightly broader carnivore diet where they include a few other foods outside of the straight up carnivore spectrum to kind of avoid that. But I do see huge implications for below this. There are some quite intelligent people who I've worked with over the years who are carnivore or near carnivore, who are following that without doing the like full comprehensive thing, and they just do have very clear gaps. And I do frame it through the lens of being like they are very intelligent people, but like if I speak to them about why these gaps exist, they'll just be like, I just don't like eating liver. I'm like, fair enough. But there's the gaps are still here.
yeah, cool. I'm sure we could say a lot of things about the carnivore diet, but let's move into another one, and one that's probably taken off a little bit more recently. Raw dairy.
I've been seeing it everywhere, and largely from not full carnivore, but close to carnivore, or people who previously were carnivore talking about it, coincidentally enough. I don't have positives to start off with, so I'm going to use a different angle here and talk about what claims do people make. And there are a few claims I see people make, like people just talking about how it's more natural, people have done it forever, whatever. But like if people are like looking for benefits beyond that, one claim I see people make is that it is more nutrient dense and might have beneficial things like probiotics. Another one, and I don't want to unpack any of these yet, but is it contains the lactase enzyme and it's easier to digest.
I've seen both of those claims as well. I think let's unpack the lactose intolerance one first, because yeah, there's this claim going around that if you've got lactose intolerance, all good, you'll be able to drink unpasteurized or raw milk. It's just not backed by science. And from what I have seen, there's a study that looks at lactose malabsorption, and there was no reported benefits. Lactose was just as malabsorbed, and there were also no reported symptom improvements.
Yeah.
So
yeah, and that randomized control trial is like the nail in the coffin. Like, because firstly, I would look at it mechanistically and be like, well, it doesn't contain the lactase enzyme. That's just like not a true claim. But they literally did do a randomized control trial where they compared to placebo, not just measuring if it contained the lactase enzyme. They literally measured the claim. Like they measured, is this causing less symptoms? And it didn't. So that's at least one claim off the table. And it's fascinating to me that claim is so commonly put out there I see it on TikTok a fair bit. Like, I could almost understand somebody talking about the digestion one. The one that's odd to me is that the claim that it contains a good amount of the lactase enzyme.
yeah, I could back onto that and say, look, if we look at other negatives, yeah, we're finding many more studies that talk about unpasteurized milk with contamination. And I think that's probably the big one. There's a reason that we brought in pasteurization years and years and years ago, so that milk can be safe for human consumption longer term. So things like E. coli, salmonella, listeria, Campylobacter, like there's so many things that can be in this milk if it is unpasteurized.
Yeah, agreed. And that's the biggest concern for everybody involved, really, as to why people are concerned about it. And if there was positives to it, I'd be more open to it. But like, we're not seeing the easy to digest thing. The probiotics claim is an interesting one, but raw milk is not really high in probiotics. The logic that people would use is that the high heats of pasteurization will destroy the probiotics. It's not really high in probiotics. And even so, there are so many other ways to get it. There's so many other ways you can achieve that thing. And nutritionally, there is minimal difference between raw milk and pasteurized milk.
I wanted to add that it actually is illegal to sell raw milk in Australia. For human consumption anyway. And yes, there are other processes where they don't use the heat to remove the bacteria. So they do high pressure processing where the bacteria is killed, but without the heat. But in Australia, you just can't, it's hard. It's pretty hard to buy raw milk unless you are buying directly from farms or things like that.
Yeah, there's certain ways in America that people can access it. But like the final thing I'd say is like, say somebody intelligent is like arguing for the safety of raw milk. Because I like to look at everything from both sides. They'd highlight that there are places you can get it from with stricter testing, where it's almost like batch testing to see if there's pathogens. That is fair. I just personally don't see the need to risk it at all, considering the minimal nutritional difference.
So that's a good one to say. Cool. Well, shall we move on to intermittent fasting then?
Yes, intermittent fasting. And this one's not so much recent. This is a forever thing. It's been around forever. But we want to talk about it because I still think it's relevant. So pros and cons. Let's start. I'll talk about some pros. So it's an easy way to reduce calories. If we went anecdotally, obviously heaps of people have reported weight loss with intermittent fasting. If we went looking at research, statistically, almost every single randomized control trial that's done on intermittent fasting has found that people have lost weight. I would add the hesitation of, if you extended the study over 2+ years, would you still see that? But if we're just looking at exclusively what I said, these often slightly shorter studies, we do see weight loss. It is an easier way to reduce calories for certain people or a lot of people. There is a proposed benefit that we'll talk about, and that's autophagy. And that could potentially carry over to things like reduced cancer risk and other healing properties, but we will also talk about that later.
Yeah, and look, like you said, I think the important caveat to add there is that this could work for some people. We could reduce caloric intake because you are likely cutting out a meal and a snack, or at least that one meal, so you are reducing overall daily caloric intake. The problem comes when people just reduce their eating window, but they still eat the same amount of food. What have you seen in practice?
Yeah, do you see that?
I have had a few people come to me with wanting to do intermittent fasting, and they are still very much eating their maintenance calories, but just in very energy-dense meals within the 8-hour window.
So I've more often seen it in what I'd call half-hearted intermittent fasting, where it's like skipping breakfast and then maybe extending the fasting window a little bit, but not so much 16-8. If I do see it in practice, I see it in people who've been doing 16-8 for longer, who've been on it for quite some time, which also does make sense. Other downsides, if we're going to talk about downsides now, I guess is, this one is obvious, but hunger. And I'm going to say hunger for certain people, because if you speak to a lot of people who do intermittent fasting, there will be a lot of people who will say that they don't feel hungry during their fasting window. I'm like, fair enough. There are a lot of people out there who also do. Fatigue for a lot of people. I also think the fatigue for a lot of people is often, I don't think ignored is the right word, but while you are doing this approach, you would almost want to intentionally mind game yourself into believing it's not existent. Many people would also report the opposite, and this would be the case for certain people where they feel like mentally clear and energized and all those things. And fair enough. That's why I'm just using the phrase for a lot of people. There are a lot of people who go long periods of time without eating, do not feel as good. Some people feel lightheaded, they get headaches, all of these things. It likely causes an inadequate intake of certain micronutrients. At a minimum, it must impact absorption, particularly the more compressed you go, the fewer meals you have. There are many micronutrients that compete for absorption. For example, iron, zinc, magnesium, and calcium. Many of these micronutrients also kind of have loose caps on how much can be absorbed in a single sitting. For example, calcium. The recommended daily intake for most people, not all people, but for most people is around 1,000 milligrams. There is a reason that calcium supplements are usually split twice a day. 2 dosages of 600 milligrams is the most common protocol. And it's because we can't really absorb 1,000 milligrams in a single sitting very easily. The more compressed your eating window is, the harder it is to meet all these things. And then often people will miss stuff just due to the choices of meals. For example, they're less likely to eat breakfast type foods if they're doing 16-8 fasting. Does this reduce intake of certain whole grains? Does it reduce intake of fruit, and so on and so forth?
I agree. And I think looking into the reason that someone is doing intermittent fasting, often it is fat loss. If there are other competing goals there, like are we looking at wanting to support muscle gain and things like that as well? If we've reduced the eating window but haven't altered the different kinds of foods that you're eating, high protein snacks, high protein meals, are you then also missing out on macronutrients there as well? So a few things to consider.
Yeah, and from a positive perspective, we do have pretty solid research showing that intermittent fasting, while done in a calorie deficit with sufficient protein, people do still tend to retain muscle quite well. We don't really have research much looking at the calorie surplus stuff for optimizing muscle gain, and this is largely due to the problem I proposed before about most people end up in a calorie deficit during these randomized control trials. So it's hard to say. We've spoken previously about protein distribution and the benefits of that. Speculatively, I assume it would be slightly suboptimal, but we don't have like-for-like comparisons. The final, I'm going to put in the neutral category take, I'd say, is with the autophagy thing. I am of the belief, with the best interpretation of the research I've got, that if you match calories over an extended duration, it likely balances out. We see far more autophagy in acute timeframes when people are fasting. That makes sense because you don't have anything coming in. This is even more pronounced during extended fasts, multiple day fasts. We would see more autophagy. I do believe, based on what I've seen, that let's say one version of a person fasts for 3 days straight out of a month, and then they eat the exact same amount of calories as somebody who did not fast but ate the same amount of calories over the course of a month. I think the autophagy balances out. There's many things that are also missed in this discussion. For example, exercise increases autophagy. Whenever we're talking about intermittent fasting, this is rarely brought up as a factor, and it's almost as if this is the only way we can achieve this. It's a process that is occurring pretty regularly throughout every day. It's not like it's switched on and off based on fasting or whatever. We do just see it much more pronounced than that. Can I say with 100% confidence that it definitely balances out? We don't have research supporting that, but I do believe that this is what likely occurs.
Let's move on to the next one then. If we chat about electrolyte drink hype. Again, this is another one that is very much going on at the moment. It hasn't been around for super long, but I'd say in the last year or so, everybody is using electrolyte supplements. Influencers are marketing electrolyte supplements as things that you have to have every single morning. As soon as you wake up, pour that into your water bottle and have electrolyte supplements. Let's talk about it.
If anyone listens to a lot of podcasts, you probably are hearing this as well. I don't like naming brands, so I won't name brands, but there are certain brands that their marketing is heavily focused on things like how people are skipping their morning coffee and replacing it with electrolytes, and now they feel like energized and all those things. I want to start with, we're going to go straight into a negative thing. The average person doesn't need electrolytes for hydration. I'm starting with this because a lot of electrolyte companies are marketing it as if you will be dehydrated without it. And the more you look at this, the more obvious it is what I'm saying, where the average person at a minimum already consumes more than enough sodium already. If we were leaning in any direction, it's almost too high. If anything, adding this into the diet of somebody who has high blood pressure could be a risky thing, particularly with the really high sodium ones. So quite a few out there that have 1,000 milligrams of sodium, recommended daily intake of sodium, pending situations like 2,000 to 2,300 milligrams. Athletes definitely go higher. But I've used the phrasing average person. The average person is not an elite athlete. I would do different things for an elite athlete.
That's where the problem lies, I think, because it is marketed at a general population level, general people who should be having these electrolyte supplements. And like you say, another con to add to that is they're expensive. Will you feel good as well if you just have a big glass of water first thing when you wake up? Very likely, yes. So I think the problem is, like you said, it's people who don't need to have that on the daily. Let's talk about it athletes then, because there are pros to electrolyte supplements, and we're not here to say you never need to have electrolyte supplements in there, because they do help replace minerals that you lose in sweat, sodium, potassium, things like that. And they can be useful for supporting muscle function, nerve signaling, and then that fluid balance as well. So they are good for rehydration, but it's more about when we would recommend them rather than having them throughout the day all the time.
Yeah, so at a minimum, the first thing I start with is context and how much we get through food. So I've done this variation of a video a few times where I talk about how much electrolytes are in certain electrolyte supplements, and then I grab a random Muscle Chef meal. I'm like, this Muscle Chef meal has 1,600 milligrams of sodium. And I use that kind of as a joke, and I'm not deliberately cherry picking, but most frozen meals will have a good amount of sodium. But then going deeper in that, we're talking about electrolytes. We're not just talking about sodium. So we're talking about potassium, magnesium. Technically, calcium is an electrolyte, but people aren't counting it in this usually. That random Muscle Chef meal will have way more potassium and magnesium than these things. And I use that to represent just having a good diet. And as long as the good diet isn't excluding sodium, you will be getting a good amount through food. But then there are times with athletes when we'll use it. Let's use examples. If I had somebody who's running a marathon, let's say they're aiming for a 3-hour time, I absolutely am including some electrolytes before and during, potentially even after. Using run as an example, it's pretty common for people to feel super lightheaded after, and you literally just give them a bunch of sodium and it'll solve that in many cases. Could we use food? I mean, technically, try having that random Muscle Chef meal during a marathon. You can see the logic where it can have heaps of benefits in certain cases.
Yeah, and I think saying that, yes, they're super beneficial for athletes during those long, potentially also more intense sessions. If they are someone who is a super heavy sweater, and that's something that we work with in practice in clinic as well, what is someone's specific sweat rate? Are they a heavy sweater, and do we need to consider it more than we would potentially with other athletes? So that there as well, but then also in the use of if someone does have gastro or is extremely dehydrated, they can be beneficial. It just always comes back to that daily use. Yeah.
The other one that often comes up in this case, I don't know if we'd have any listeners in this case, is POTS as well. So how high would you go with sodium for certain people with POTS?
I push it up there sometimes. Yeah. So in general, minimum we do at least 2 to 3 of those 1,000 milligrams a day, and then we can push it high, up to some people take 5,000 to 6,000.
Yeah, and you absolutely could get that through food. I just think in a lot of cases it's more convenient to get through these supplements, and You could then argue about cost and be like, yes, you could put salt and like put it like there's many ways you could do it, but it's often more convenient through these.
I think that's everything that I've got to say on that. Yeah I think the big thing is just if anyone's listening, you don't fall for that marketing, because it is the marketing that has pushed it to be something that you feel like you need to have all the time, which isn't the case.
Yeah. Now we're going to talk about GLP-1 agonist supportive diets, and this is something that's more on my TikTok than your TikTok. So I'll have a spiel. You can add anything you want after it, but like this is what I've seen the most. So there's two variations of it. This second one, I'm going to start with. This one is less of what I intended on talking about, but I will talk about it. Is sometimes people are talking about foods or approaches or supplements that can raise GLP-1 levels in the body. So we're not talking about this in relation to the medication. They're talking about it for people not on the medication wanting to raise this to then help with their hunger. And that is a hugely flawed idea, because if we look at GLP-1 levels naturally, we get these like quick spikes and then drops. It does not really move the needle on appetite at all. GLP-1 agonists, the medications, have gotten around this problem. Being clearer, because I probably should mention this, we're talking about things like Ozempic, Wegovy, and semaglutide. I don't know if I've shared thoughts on the podcast before. I'm neutral on these. I see pros and cons. I see this with like all medications. I think all medications have pros and cons. I think it's enough for me to just say I'm neutral and not have to like go deep on that take, but I'll do that. I'll just leave it there and then continue on with the next thing. When else could it be bad? When somebody is somewhat of a charlatan, basically acting as if your diet needs to be dramatically different on these medications to really take advantage of them. And they're not talking about it like through the lens of a calorie deficit or managing symptoms, but more as if it's like specific foods to do special things in relation to this. I want to go the opposite angle here. When could a GLP-1 supportive diet be a good thing? And I see so many benefits here. I see it as there are many common issues that arise when people are on these medications. I personally think anything that specifically addresses those issues is probably a good thing. If I'm going to list these issues, we can then work backwards from there. Muscle mass is one of the most common concerns that people have talked about. There was a study that came out a while ago where participants lost a decent amount of weight, but 40% came from lean mass. And I read comments more than I should. And there's a lot of comments out there whenever these medications are mentioned where people are talking about how it leads to muscle loss, or they'll also talk about bone loss as well. Based on everything we know about the mechanism of action and everything we know about all of these things, it's unlikely the medications cause that muscle loss. This is just what happens when you lose a lot of weight on a low protein diet and you're not exercising. And without going too deep on that, the medication could lower the bar in terms of making it easier to lose weight and could therefore indirectly mean less people are exercising well on it. I truly do not want that to be viewed through the lens of me saying people are looking at this as the easy way out or anything like that. I just think it can make it easier to lose weight. The next thing though is protein. It is so understandable that people's protein intake drops, partly because they might feel nauseous, they're not hungry, they've got all of these things going on. So any way we can address that, like firstly, like obviously I'm always going to encourage exercise. And then the second thing is anything we can do to get more protein in. The next one is ensuring doing anything we can to help food-wise to help people fuel their training, feel good with their training and everything like that. It makes it even harder to exercise regularly if you do not feel good during those sessions. Constipation and nausea are very common problems. This is actually a big reason why a lot of people who start the medication stop the medications. And seeing this occur without outside guidance or anything like that, my first instinct is always like, I just wish that there was some way I could have been involved to like help with managing those symptoms. Like there's so many things we can do from a constipation perspective and a nausea perspective. And then the other obvious one is low intake just in general, a massive calorie deficit in many cases. There are things we can do to support that in terms of having a more nutrient-rich intake. But even the simplest one could be like a multivitamin, which could cover a bunch of gaps. So any of those like many examples of how we could help people who are on those, I think that can be a positive way of viewing these as GLP-1 supportive diets.
Yeah, I agree. I'm also very neutral. I agree with a lot of what you just said. The issue, again, I think I'm just going to add on to what you've just said. So I agree. If we can optimize diet intake while taking GLP-1 medication, that's how it should be regardless. The issue lies when people do believe that it's a magic fix and they don't change diet accordingly. So if they're still eating a very high intake of discretionary foods, lots of fats, not only does the mechanism of those medications change how you digest food, so you may feel quite sick in the stomach. If you're eating high fat, you may get lots of reflux, that sort of thing. It becomes a problem. So changing it accordingly so that you can make the most of the medication but also optimize your diet, that's where I think that happy medium lies.
Yeah, I agree for sure. And I'm just an optimistic person. So like I just view it through the lens of like, rather than me viewing it as it's a shame when somebody takes these medications and doesn't change these diets or change their diet, I view it through the lens of these medications do not stop people from changing their diets. So if we viewed all other things equal, this could be something that like factors in. I think everyone would view it that way, but it's almost like if you ever hear me like not talking about that, it's just because I just have like optimism blinders on. I'm just like, of course I encourage exercise. Of course I encourage, like, I don't know.
Anything else that you wanted to add
No,
onto that?
that covers everything. That's all 5. So as we were speaking about, like, as we were writing this out, like, there's heaps of things we can talk about. So if anyone does have feedback, please let us know.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for listening, guys. This has been episode 224, where we share our thoughts on these 5 current diet trends. We hope you've learnt something, and please leave us a review if you haven't done so yet. Thank you.